So I'll start by showing you the beginning of a 45-minute film by the Canadian artist Michael Snow, and the film is Wavelength. I show this to my third-year students, and it's from 1967. Ian, do you want it? Hit the lights.
Yes.
Back. So if I'm honest, most of the teaching that I do out of choice would be about what a former colleague of mine described as unpopular culture. And Wavelength is right at the heart of the stuff I enjoy thinking about and teaching. The film has been described as a 45-minute zoom from one end of the room to the other. And while that's not entirely accurate, it does give you a sense of what sort of film it is. In fact, the camera zooms into a photograph that's on the wall there. And for many people, it's a boring film. Nothing much happens, and the stuff that does happen is boring. So it changes from day to night. The filmmaker places coloured gels in front of the camera lens, and so on. There's a bit of comedic action about halfway through, when a man staggers into the room and keels over, but the camera just carries on zooming into the far wall. And about 10 minutes into the film, the soundtrack changes, and I'm just going to skip into the film a bit further on in a minute. It changes to a sine wave, so you heard the kind of location sound there, and it changes to this electronic sine wave that gradually increases in pitch as the film progresses. So for many people, the film's not only boring, it's also irritating. And it becomes like a form of torture. And the sine wave means you can't really sort of switch off. It's constantly there, pissing you off. So a few minutes later it sounds like this. But I won't torture you. I first saw the film when I was a student back in the early 1980s, although I don't really remember anything of the experience of watching the film then. And it was still being screened to third-year FRTV students when I returned to Christchurch in the late 90s as a lecturer. At that time the film was screened and taught by a colleague, and then later I took it over and it became integrated into my own teaching. And it's a film that's had an important influence on my own work and thinking. When it was taught back at the end of the 90s, screenings were often quite rowdy. I remember students talking all the way through the film, throwing bits of paper at each other, and on one occasion somebody threw a paper dart at my colleague. They were rebelling. Now I thought my colleague's post-screening analysis of the film was brilliant, but I remember saying to him after the session that the discussion of the film with the students was like pulling teeth. They weren't really engaging with the film. In part, I think, this lack of engagement was a result of the way the film was being taught, the context within which it was being situated and discussed. Although I could appreciate and even admire my colleagues' analysis of the film, I came to feel more and more that it was the wrong approach to take. The film was framed as a sort of attack on Hollywood cinema, a rejection of the forms and styles and content of mainstream narrative film. So it was always being discussed in relation to what it was not. And it was always being compared with this absent paradigm, the model of the classical Hollywood narrative. So the film, it was argued, rejected narrative. And sure, there is something of this in it. In the bit I mentioned earlier, when the man comes into frame and falls over, the reference point is, of course, the codes and conventions of classical narrative cinema. The filmmaker Michael Snow is obviously having a bit of fun here. Now, it's understandable that my colleague would have taken this approach to the film, since much of the critical writing around it and around other films like it, usually termed structural film, adopted this approach. So one of the leading theorists and practitioners of structural film, Peter Goodall, wrote, quote, "Such film mitigates against dominant narrative cinema." Another critic from the time, this is the late 70s, a critic called Philip Drummond, he's writing here about avant-garde film more generally, quote, our definition of avant-garde film will clearly hinge upon the qualities we associate with the broader context of mainstream, or what we might call dominant cinema. In this case, the avant-garde will then be typified by its opposition to norms and values within its opposite. This practice of situating films in relation to an absent other continues to exert influence on critical thinking, as evidenced by the following quote from a piece by Orleen Denise McMahon, written in 2009, not about this film, but about one of Michael Snow's contemporaries. The fact that this type of film making remains the most marginal and least understood means that we must resort to Hollywood and its commercial films as a critical yardstick for analysing avant-garde film. But to return to Wavelength, I felt and feel that analysis of the film that takes rejection, negation and antithesis as a starting point doesn't get you very far. It's soon exhausted. And the fundamental weakness of this approach is that you're always taking your eye off the thing that you're meant to be looking at. That is, rather than engaging with the specificity of the thing you're meant to be thinking about, you're using a critical strategy that's directing you to this abstracted model of an absent other. You always end up talking about what the film isn't rather than what it is. A more productive approach, it seemed to me, will be to talk about the film on its own terms, and to use a phrase I absolutely love, to dig the groove that it's in. Now, one thing you might do is say something like, well, it's not really boring. You might say this to your students. I wouldn't. If you approach it as a minimalist piece of work, then your attention's drawn to the details that would be lost in narrative work, where you're thinking about the story and the characters and so on. So you might really look at the objects in the room, like the chair. You really look carefully at the colours and the shapes and so on, the change from day to night, changes on the soundtrack. You could really exhaust it through, intense looking. But I think if you said this, you'd be in denial. I mean, it's not going to get you through 45 minutes. Watching the film is a bit of a boring experience. And it's easy for your mind to start wandering as you watch it, although you're constantly brought back by this irritating whine. Not just my teaching, I mean the I enjoyed that, because that's improvisation. And this is me speaking as someone who's actually, I think, probably watched this film more times than almost anybody on earth. Okay. So one of the strategies that you might adopt in order to dig the groove that it's in, and it's pretty obvious, will be to investigate authorial intention. A pretty obvious and standard way of looking at any highly authored text such as this. And I've got a nice one-page handout of an interview with Michael Snow that I use with the students. And it's quite fun because it's 1969, it's got this playful, sort of counter-cultural feel to it. And in any case, Snow's a bit of a joker. So at one point, this is in the interview, he's asked by the interviewer, what would you say to a spectator who, after a few minutes, wants to walk out? And he answers, this is of its time, I might be interested in his or her reasons, it might be interesting to discuss them, it might lead to friendship or sexual intercourse or both. And so on. There's loads of stuff like this in the interview. I get the students to read the handout immediately after seeing the film, and I ask them to pick out the bits that seem to make sense of the film for them. And there are a number of things that tend to come up. So Snow talks about everything in the image having equal value, nothing being privileged over anything else. So I guess this does hint at other modes of filmmaking in which some things are privileged above others. So we might talk then about Hollywood film or whatever it might be. But that's not where I want to take the conversation usually. Snow also talks about the sine wave being more real than the location sound, and the students usually pick up on this, and there's a good discussion about kind of what's real in representation and so on, and that usually goes for a good few minutes. And all this stuff's a useful way into the film. But I think the knockout punch in the interview, which actually surprisingly few students pick up on, is where Snow describes the film as a time monument. When I draw attention to this, I often draw a blank. So I ask, okay, if you're an artist, how could you create a monument to time? Well, you could build an ornate sundial, or you could build Stonehenge, or you could write Vivaldi's The Four Seasons and so on. Or you could present your audience with a chunk of time, a slice of time, 45 minutes of it. And you might develop various artistic strategies to draw attention to the passage of time itself, trying to make duration visible and audible, helping us to see it stretch out. Where's Simon? Has he done a runner? Okay. Stretch out in front of us, rather than being an invisible container for things that happen. And this set of ideas usually gets a good response from me mostly. So I can riff on time. That's something I really like talking about. But it's this that brings us back to the idea of boredom. When I discuss the experience of watching the film with the students, the line I like to use, phrased as a question, is, well, isn't boredom just the taste of time? I'm very proud of that. This is why I'm sharing it today. Isn't boredom just the taste of time? So rather than trying to fight the boredom the film instills in the audience, what I hope I try to do, working with the students, is to tune into that boredom, to give it value. Now, this is a very specific case of a boring film. I teach lots of boring films, and I suppose there are different strategies for different sorts of films. But to conclude, I guess that my general approach and attitude to teaching boring films is always the same. First of all, to try to avoid comparison with so-called mainstream cinema, although that sometimes is useful, and also to try to dig the groove that it's in. That's it.
Hey. It hasn't encouraged me to watch Way of that, though. Still, any questions for Andy? Yes, Jamie.
Do you preface that with, this is a boring film for the students? How do you introduce what is a fairly difficult kind of concept?
Yeah, you couldn't spring it on them. I mean, it's within the context of a course where we're a few weeks in and they've seen some quite tough stuff, even though it's shorter. So they get where it's going. And there is a bit of a setup where... So this is part of almost like a movement, I suppose you could say, structural film. So it comes after a number of sessions where we're talking about how filmmakers move from, let's say, taking the ideas in painting and applying to the film, to sort of focusing on film as a kind of medium in its own right. So they've got to sort of steer on a kind of minimalist approach and focusing on the kind of inherent qualities of the medium. I will say a little bit about it. I'll say, it's quite a tough film to watch, so you need to be sort of prepared for it, but we'll talk about it afterwards. But actually, it's a film that I'm surprised how many students choose to write about it. At the end of the first term, they seemed to quite enjoy it. And what they all say is the same. They all say, "I was really boring to watch, but I really enjoyed the discussion, and I enjoyed thinking about it afterwards." So that's quite nice in terms of not all my teaching is successful in that way, but this little bit seems to work.
Sarah first and then Bob.
Do you think you could get the same quality of discussion afterwards without necessarily showing students the whole film?
No, because you have to sat through for the line that I'm trying to use. You have to experience that chunk of time. So if the film was shorter, that would be fine, but the film isn't. The film is 45 minutes, and it starts at one place and ends at another. And of course they can, because it only does one thing really, they can see time stretching ahead of them. They know what the end of the film is going to be, or at least they can guess. And so they're sort of measuring out the time. They've got to wait until that moment when we're fully in on the photograph. So it could only work in that chunk. Sorry?
We could cut out 5 minutes.
Nice, it's zooming, so you've noticed it.
Yeah, it is a bit jerky. Actually, you probably could get away with it. But I wouldn't. No, it's fine.
Paul.
Thanks, Andrew, that's great. In an age of sort of instant culture, instant politics and things, isn't there something to be said for boredom and things being boring. I mean, you know, you presented this as quite as boring as pejoratively in a pejorative service. I'm speaking up for boredom.
Well, you're pushing at an open door, I'm telling you. Yeah. I mean, boredom's beautiful. I mean, just the idea that you could be bored. There'd be a space in which you could be bored, and then, you know what happens when you're bored, then you start to get creative, don't you? And then, you know, you're thinking new ideas and stuff like that. But I guess I'm going at it as an experience of time, really, I suppose. And it's how you, like I say, taste time, how you feel time, or duration, yeah.
Right.
I think that pause is really important, actually, the pause that the film kind of creates. And you could argue that painting is super boring because it doesn't even move.
But people only spend a few seconds looking at it, right?
Yeah, but if you put students, which I have done in front of a painting, and there's something supposed to happen, and we don't say anything for the first 5 minutes, that 5 minutes becomes the experience of the painting. And that, in a sense, is an introduction in a sense to difficulty. And what I kind of pick up from what you're doing, and I love, is a celebration of difficulty. Why do we have to keep pretending to students that what we're trying to communicate to them is easy? It hasn't been easy for us, so why should we get involved in that lie that it's going to be easy for them? And I think once you can get over that, then it opens up a really fascinating territory. You know, like the whole Holocaust thing. It's difficult, okay? It's just difficult. You know, I mean, one of my favourite painters, Philip Guston, was asked, you know, he said, I find your paintings very difficult. And he said, yes, and the problem is I have to make them too. which returned the difficulty back onto himself as shared that difficulty with the audience, rather than saying, I'm this easy painter who makes difficult paintings. You know, he's saying, I make these are difficult images, and part of the difficulty is that I have to make them.
I have a similar problem to what Brian's articulating. I'm someone who keeps using the absent other in my teaching. People keep saying, why do you keep referring to the thing we're not looking at? And kind of genuinely, I don't understand. I kind of think that my assumption is that we're all able to hold more than one contrary thought in our mind, and that the intersection of these two things is the useful point. That you could be watching that thinking, oh, it's not like that. Oh, wow, it's not like that. But invariably people say to me, I should be avoiding that. I'm absolutely relaxed and I don't change it. I suppose, how do other people feel? Is there an issue with using that absent other, or is it just another one of these institutional, or in order to be an effective teacher, you have to be as blatant, as spoon-feeding as possible?
I mean, the absent other, I wouldn't totally get rid of it. I think that, because I've written about this elsewhere, you know, at a certain historical moment, for example, it was important to, you know, the battling against this, that and the other. And that moment's not over. There are just different things to fight against and to challenge and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying it's not got a use. I think the problem is when it's just the kind of automatic go-to way of teaching a particular thing, as it seems to have been for many years. I'm not just talking about my colleague, I'm talking about the whole critical stuff around it. Is that you're missing a trick. You know, you're sort of narrowing your critical horizon by doing that.
Or are you saying that there are lots of things external to this that you can... My concern is, what are the absent others that you cut away and discard? In the end, you just end up with a solitary text in the centre, and that's the...
Well, that's hard enough, isn't it? I mean, to come to terms with things on their terms, I think that's quite a good thing to be doing, and that's quite a hard thing to do as well. I don't know how to do it. I mean, I'm just talking about, you know, one instance where I failed to do something. It's a challenge. It's hard to even think about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, even the notion of teaching film itself carries within it the expectation of pleasure.
Yeah.
And so you're also fighting, not fighting against it, but you're resisting that in a way. And I really admire this approach. As somebody who is always doing the absent other, teaching about Hollywood cinema, I just know that I don't give the students enough opportunity to think about alternatives, and it's that notion of alternative ways of presenting. Not that I would sit them down in front of wavelength, mind you, but you know, I'd like a short sharp. Can you give us a kind of a wave?
Which is why your modules recruit like 50 students and I get like 16 or something.
No. It may not all be down to that, Andy.
Thanks, Kenny.
And do you see the crossover in practice? I mean, do you talk here from your colleagues that they're following through?
How do you mean, Jane?
Well, in terms of, you know, with the alternative, you know, against obviously Hollywood style, do you ever see some of the texts that they've gone down this road? So they've been inspired by the minimalist?
Well, I'm not interested in other people's work. I'm only interested in my own, and definitely my own is totally down this route, and more and more so.
Are you seeing it with students in some of the other modules?
No, very rarely.
I see it.
Oh,
do you?
Students that, yeah, there are definitely students who
We
are
have a
influenced
guinea
by
pig.
non-mainstream work.
Ben, do you do any? Have you done any minimalist stuff? You didn't do Andy's course, did you?
I didn't do Andy's course
No.
like that.
NMD.
Oh yeah, mixed media. Yeah, there's a lot of painting referenced in that, which I guess is pretty minimalist. I think I referenced some paintings in my dissertation actually.
Yeah. But in terms of making your own films?
Not really. Mostly narratively driven and lots of editing, lots of cuts, lots of scrap. Well, not kind of that. But
In your dissertation
yeah.
on cinematography, yes, you actually created some scenes, yes,
Yeah.
which looks at the way that certain aspects of creating filmic narrative were constructed in Coen Brothers film, yes,
Yeah.
that completely subverted the standard Hollywood thing, yes,
I guess so.
and you actually made some film that did that, did you not?
Maybe in a different module, but they were kind of like referenced each other.
So,
Yeah.
So the wavelength is there and in the atmosphere. This is what you create.
Maybe.
Wonderful. Okay, can we thank Andy again?